Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the close call. This story was posted to Reddit by Kane55, and they wrote, quote, "This particular night I had run out of burritos and chicken. I also shut the thing down and cleaned it all out about an hour before closing. About 5 minutes before I was closing up, a guy walked in and asked for some burritos. I told him I was out of them and that I was just about to close and the fryers were shut down. He walked around the store for a minute. I assumed he was looking for something else to buy, and then he came up to the counter, pulled out a weapon, and told me if I didn't cook him some burritos, he was going to harm me. I freaked out, but I told him I had none to cook. I showed him the freezer and told him I would happily cook anything he wanted from it, but I was out of burritos. He looked in it for a minute, turned to me and said, 'You really are out.' I replied, 'Yeah.' He then put the weapon away and left the store." In our number 9 spot today, we have the bad driver. This story was posted to Reddit by the user novelty_bone, and they wrote, quote, "There was the time a woman drove her car into the 7-Eleven I worked overnights at. All started when a guy no-called, no-showed again. I get called in so the guy doesn't have to work 24 hours straight. Goes well, I'm tired, counting cash, 4 a.m., and all of a sudden I hear a loud noise behind me. Then the rack of cigarettes behind me rains down on me like a waterfall. Once the cigarettes stopped, I used colorful language to ask what was happening, to myself, but out loud, and go check outside. There's a Jeep pulled back into the spot. I check if the driver's okay, and she is, but I hear through her phone that didn't seem to be on speaker, 'How the bleep did you crash into a 7-Eleven?' So I call the cops and the owner. It all gets worked out, but when the cops arrived, they first laughed, then breathalyzed and alphabet tested the woman to see if she was intoxicated. She was not, just a tired/bad driver. I'm betting bad based on the phone call I overheard." In our number 8 spot today, we have the terrifying encounter. This Reddit story was posted by the user I am working AMA, and they started off their story by explaining that they had a lot of regulars who seemed to be going through difficult times and maybe struggling from some substance use issues, but that most of them weren't troublesome or violent. They go on to write that one of these regulars comes into the store where they work and he, quote, "wanders around the aisles, occasionally looking over and staring at me for 10 seconds or so each time. After the last customer leaves, he comes up and pulls out a small pocket blade, the Swiss Army kind, looks at me and says, 'I was supposed to do something very bad to you, but I decided not to, I think,' all while opening and closing this thing. Robbing me is one thing, but this guy just directly threatened my life. At this point, the man now hands them the thing. Just hands it over and says, 'Hold on to this for me.' He then looks around for a bit and then asks for it back. Of course, the instinct is to not give it back, but at the same time, this man is also much larger than the employee, so they decided not to cause any more trouble and just give it back. From there, the man just told them to keep their eyes open, and then he left. In our number 7 spot today, we have the scary customer. This Reddit story was posted by the user Morthern, and they wrote, quote, "I work night shifts. During the weekdays, it's pretty quiet, usually only the truckers and taxi drivers who pop by for coffee and the sandwiches that we have. But one night I was talking with one of the cab drivers. A car drives into the parking lot, parks, and it sits with its floodlights on bright, aimed towards the glass front. Kinda weird, but maybe the guy forgot what light he got on. It happens. The guy finally enters after maybe 5 minutes of flooding the store part with light, and it's obvious he's on something. He's jittery, wide-eyed, looks disheveled, paces around before he buys a coffee, and stares intensely at me throughout the purchase. Worth mentioning, I'm a 5'2" chick and I smile friendly to everyone, but I work alone for 8 hours in the dead of night. Eerie guy pays for his coffee without a single word, so I continue talking with the cab driver, but I still feel this guy staring at me. It was very intense and unsettling. Cab guy probably notices this and leans on the counter, slides his card over while talking a bit hushed that I should call him when I get off work if this guy sticks around because he's getting very creepy vibes from him. Cab guy was right. This guy stuck around the shop for about an hour till closing, just staring at me until some truckers arrived, then he left and sat in his car, parked up against the window, staring until closing time. I called the driver and he gave me a free ride home. He later told me this weirdo had been driving behind his taxi with his lights on full power. In our number 6 spot today, we have the mouthwash. This Reddit story starts off at a store in Missouri. The poster wrote, quote, "Had a guy in our parking lot doing what looked to be Tai Chi at 1 a.m. He would do the motions, then kickflip off the side of the building and go back to doing the motions. We told him he needed to stop doing that. He goes to the pump, takes the nozzle off, buzzes for inside pay, chooses a grade of fuel, and splashes it in his mouth. He spits it out, chooses another grade, and then does it again. This is the point where we called the cops. After he decided he was done mouth-washing with fuel, he comes in and just starts loading up with bags of chips, candy bars, a single 12-ounce Bud Light from a 6-pack. Half of the stuff was opened. Cop got there, told the guy he had to pay, then put him in the back of his car. That would have been quite an eventful and also kind of a horrifying night shift. In our number 5 spot today, we have this string of thefts. In the early hours of Wednesday morning back in March of this year, a series of harrowing events unfolded across Chicago as armed robberies targeted multiple 7-Eleven stores. The police were unable to confirm any direct links between the robberies, but a very clear pattern emerged, with the suspects escaping in a black SUV, leaving residents and businesses on edge. Julianne Logan, a resident of the West Loop, expressed her unease, stating, quote, "It makes me feel unsafe knowing that I could just be at 7-Eleven and something could happen." One of the affected stores, located at the intersection of Morgan and Monroe Streets, had transitioned to accepting credit cards only as a result of being one of the 4 establishments targeted by the armed robbers. In one incident, 2 armed male suspects stormed the 7-Eleven, announcing a robbery and seizing cash from 2 registers. They further made off with a customer's black Jeep Cherokee, escaping in the stolen vehicle. Another robbery occurred on West Crenshaw Street, and a third incident unfolded on West Towie Avenue. The final robbery took place on Northwestern Avenue, where the same pattern repeated itself: 2 armed individuals, cash stolen, and a swift escape in a black SUV. Although no injuries were reported, thankfully, the lack of apprehension in connection with these crimes has heightened concerns. Area 3 detectives were left to piece together the puzzle, conducting a very thorough investigation. In our number 4 spot today, we have the weird regular. This story was posted by the Reddit user Smalls244, and they wrote about working at a store in a really small town. They then go on to explain that they would often have a customer at the store who had a glass eye and who would walk around with a 5-gallon bucket of pickled pig's feet. Quote, "The pig's feet were submerged in this pink juice that would splash all over the damn place when he walked around. Not to mention that during the summer, the bucket would reek." So, one of my first days on the job, he came into the gas station to buy a tall boy Bud Ice. I rang him up and he plunged his hand down into the bucket and pulled out a pig's foot, in which he slammed onto the counter. After a bit of back and forth explaining that pig's feet were not a form of currency, I just gave in and let him have the $2 beer. I paid for it myself. So, about once a week, he would walk in and we would have this pickled pig foot Bud Ice understanding. Other customers in line would lose their minds after seeing this deal go down. I'd throw the pig's feet in the woods out back where the stray cats would eat them. It was a whole ecosystem of weirdness. In our number 3 spot today, we have the creepy customer. This creepy story, posted to Reddit by user Heavy Blossoms, is just another reminder of the terrifying world of social media. They wrote, quote, "I go by my nickname at work and have my real name on Facebook. A customer found and friend requested me somehow. I used to think it was my name on the receipt, but I'm more inclined to think he looked up the business and went through the members/likes/whatever section, hundreds of people, until he found me. He sent me a message that said, 'You work at business name. I was there last night.' I never responded." This story is short, but leaves me with absolute chills. There is something seriously strange about that entire situation. In our number 2 spot today, we have the emergency button. This is a story about something that would have been great for the employee to know before being in a terrifying situation. Posted to Reddit by the user Skeever2, they explained that this is something that happened to their friend. While working a shift, they had the unfortunate experience of having someone begin attempting to rob the store. A true nightmare, so scary, an awful situation. They of course press the emergency button under the counter. This seems great until they realize that this button locks the door, which means that they are now locked inside the store with the now panicking armed assailant. They finish off their post by writing, quote, "His boss later told him it was to prevent people from getting away. I mean, it did also put in a call to the alarm company, who eventually called the police, but for a good 25 minutes he really thought he was going to die there. In the end, it seems like he was totally unharmed, so thank goodness for that, but what a crazy story." And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the missing assailant. This is a creepy story that happened actually quite recently. Late in the evening on the night of May 10th, 2023, the 7-Eleven convenience store in Port Colborne fell victim to a harrowing incident. At precisely 11:13 p.m., the tranquility of the night shattered as a masked intruder stormed through its doors, wielding a menacing weapon. The startled employees watched in terror as the glass case shattered under the assailant's violent demands for money. Fear gripped the hearts of the workers, but they complied, handing over an undisclosed sum to the thief. With his ill-gotten gains in hand, the intruder intruder swiftly fled the scene, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby alley, leaving behind a wake of disbelief. Thankfully, no customers or employees suffered physical harm during the ordeal. Despite the swift response from the Niagara Regional Police Service, the elusive suspect managed to evade capture so far. Determined to bring justice to the traumatized convenience store staff, the tenacious detectives from the 3rd District Welland Detective Office, aided by the skilled investigators from the Forensic Services Unit, took charge of the case. Their diligent efforts now focused on unraveling the identity and whereabouts of this very mysterious and scary robber. As the investigation unfolds, hope remained high that the expertise of these dedicated law enforcement professionals would lead to the apprehension of the culprit, providing solace to the community shaken by this chilling encounter.
Number 10. Ghost of the Dead. This worker said, "We had a younger man a few weeks ago who passed suddenly. One night after closing up and hitting the lights, we walked towards the back hallway. As I looked down the hall before heading out the door, I saw a man with dark hair and a dark suit at the end, just standing there. I thought it was a director, and when I blinked, he was gone. The director with me that day was in a light gray suit and had blonde hair. The next day, I went to close the casket in the chapel. Lo and behold, it was the same gentleman that was in the hallway the day before. 2 of my coworkers said they experienced similar events, such as when walking past his casket, they felt they bumped into someone, but no one was there." That is creepy, I'm telling you. Ugh. Number 9. Stolen body. Julie Mott, who lost her life battling against cystic fibrosis, left behind a mysterious case post her death. While the funeral should have been a part of the grieving process for her friends and family, the funeral was the start of a new nightmare. Sometime after the visitation and just before closing of the funeral home, someone took Julie's body. Yeah, they just left with it. The police and family were stunned to hear this, for no one knows who actually stole the body. Theories of an obsessive unidentified boyfriend, involvement of the funeral home itself have been formed, but it is still unknown as how and where did Julie's body disappear. Now this is scary and just sad. How can someone disappear with a dead body and no one noticed? Number 8. Ghost lady. This worker said, "Most nights as we were returning to quarters from a run, my partner and I would scope the parking lot for vagrants or people who shouldn't be there before we opened the bay doors. While looking on more than one occasion, we would see a light on in the adjacent building on the top floor, and there should have been no lights on. Figuring someone had gotten inside, we would watch the building for more lights. No other lights ever came on, but on every occasion, a young woman in a dress would come to the window and stare at us. One night after seeing the figure, we got brave and called some law enforcement friends from the area to help us search the building. We went to the room that had the light on expecting to find a vagrant camped out there, but the only thing we found was a room that had untouched dust on the floor and no light bulbs in the sockets. We got the willies and split, and we never went back to that building at night." Yeah, I would never go back to that building. Ever. Like, that sounds terrifying. Number 7. Missing head. In July 1986, Anthony Parisi passed away at the age of 83. Anthony, a co-founder of a grocery store in Mount Vernon, New York, died of natural causes. He was sent to a funeral home, and on July 26, the employees of the funeral home went to prepare him for his burial, but when they looked into his casket, they discovered that his head was missing. Yeah, just his whole head, just poof. Gone. The police were called, and they speculated that someone broke into the funeral home during midnight and used a razor or scalpel to remove the head. Once the head was cut off, the intruder took it with them. Nothing else in the funeral home was stolen or perturbed. There weren't even signs of break-in. The police were baffled by the case, and they have no idea who stole the head, why it was stolen, and they don't know what happened to it because it was never found. Number 6. Spirits of the dead. This online user said, "My grandpa was a mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. One day, her boyfriend Tom came over to the house and no one was home. They'd been dating for a while and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and windows into the morgue were open, so he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything, and went into the house. A few minutes later, he heard a loud slamming noise come from the morgue, so he ran man to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open again. He got out of there real quick, and when he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up a deceased woman that morning and the spirits were welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time, Tom should just leave the doors and windows open. Number 5. Doppelganger. This worker says, I was once working at a mortuary and had to pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get the receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double checked the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos and similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, hey, how's it going? Ah, holy that guy looks like you. It's the only case I've had nightmares about that I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening it up. Now that sounds absolutely horrifying and I can't imagine that happening. Number 4. New home. A family bought a funeral home and turned it into a house, which, like, why? But this is what the father said of the experience. Many people that have worked here or rented have told me about hearing sounds and seeing black shadows during all hours. One of the things that turned me to wonder about all of this even more is the children saying things about a black fog in different rooms during the night. It's apparent that something is causing all of this: whispers in the hallway, lights going out and coming back on, leaving rooms with lights on and seeing them turn off, even water turning on and off. Finally, when people remodeling came to me and said something about a high-pitched drilling noise from the basement one afternoon, I told myself and my wife I'd humor everyone and speak with a local psychic. I did so the same afternoon of the drilling, and the psychic was a nice lady, but I was frustrated that all she kept saying and insisting to me was that I shouldn't remodel and stir up the spirits in the building, and I am causing nothing but problems some people in the community would choose to forget. Before the phone call ended, I remember very well the last thing she said: "You, sir, are playing with fire." So after a few days, I called a local Christian preacher who prayed for me and claimed I was involved in a demonic process and should come to church Sunday morning before it's too late. He did finally come over to the building and did some water sprinkles of whatever it is called around the place, but when he left, everything started freaking out. Lights would turn off and on, and we would start getting lightheaded sometimes when we walked through areas of the building. So now, ever since that day, my wife won't stay in a room alone when we are here. We still don't really have any clear answers on the building, the items inside, or its terrible history, but after we finish remodeling, we hopefully clean and rid ourselves of the spirits of Jacob's funeral home. Now, this is literally the beginning of a horror movie, and they should move out. Like, right now. Number 3. Peeking from the hallway. This is a story about someone's childhood experience. They said, "There aren't many options in my town for funeral homes, so almost everyone in town has been to all of them at some point in their lives for service. I remember as a child sitting on a chair in the lobby of one of the more prominent funeral homes, bored out of my mind during a visitation for a distant relative. A kid I knew from school walks up and says hi, and we start to chat when something catches my eye. Far down the hallway, going into a closed off area of the funeral home, I see the hands of an old man come around the corner and grasp onto the wall. Slowly, the old man peeks his head around the corner and just stares blankly down the hallway into the visitation room. I'm thoroughly weirded out, and I look over at my friend who is staring down the hall. He turns to me and says, "What is he doing?" When we look back, the man is gone. I'm sorry, but the image of that is absolutely terrifying. I hate it. I have goosebumps. No. He continued on by saying, "We didn't ever really talk about it again until 20 years later when I got a call from my old friend out of the blue. He says this is going to sound crazy, but do you remember the old man at the funeral home? It was a little hazy on it, but I did remember." He continues to say, "Well, I was just there and my daughter saw him. During the viewing for my Uncle Bill, she came over and asked my wife why the creepy man down the hallway was staring around the corner at was staring around the corner at Uncle Bill, and there wasn't anyone there, man. I could hear the fear in his voice and I instantly got chills. I have been back to that funeral home many times now and I've not seen anything else, but I still get uneasy anytime I walk past that hallway, and yeah, that makes sense. Number 2. Body moved by itself. This online user said my neighbor a while back before I moved in was a mortician. One night he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service. Whatever was going on, it was unusual and it required him to work in the wee hours in the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight or flight instinct immediately kicked in and he ran to the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. He was just near the top before his senses finally came back and he knew it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it was. He'd been doing this for 15 to 20 years at that point, and he had never had a freakout like that before where instinct took over knowledge and experience. He actually sheepishly admitted he had to go clean himself because he had soiled his pants in a panic. Dead bodies do weird things, I'm telling you. But I would probably have to change my pants too if that happened to me. And coming in at number 1 is waking up. This is a story a user posted online saying when my cousin was 18, he was in a bad wreck, and he, his girlfriend, and his sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" Yep. He wasn't actually dead. The funeral director said it was the first time he had ever had to go home and change his pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital, and the same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead, but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state. But a few weeks later, he walked out of the hospital. He has horrible headaches on occasion, but he's led a successful life and he's a great guy. I mean, what a positive turn of events, but that would be so shocking. It's one thing for the body to move on its own, but speak, that's on a whole new level.
Alright, let's get into this with our number 10 now, which is Blue Eyes. This one comes from Hot Sheet Hotel. He said that when he was in high school in the late 70s, he and his best friends worked in a cemetery as groundskeepers. It was their job to trim the hedges and keep the grounds tidy. They often had to remove dead flowers or notes from graves. One day, they found something truly shocking: a naked, dead body. It was a young woman around the same age as them. She was actually a student at a neighboring high school. She'd been left there neatly with her arms at her sides on that foggy morning. She had been strangled right there. A killer had also punched her several times in the face before she died. The police identified her quickly, but her clothes were never found and her murder never solved. He and his friends got grilled by the police, but they quickly realized the boys were just as shocked and confused as everyone else. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the fresh corpse. This one comes from Adele Vetica. She said that one night she drove up to her usual spot when she noticed a white car blocking the road. She parked behind it, got out of her car and started walking up the hill to her office. As she made her way up the brick path, she looked ahead to see someone there in the lamplight. They were slouched against the railing with their head facing down. At first she thought it was a homeless person, not an unusual occurrence. As she got closer though, she realized something was seriously wrong. She saw that they weren't actually alive. It was the body of a woman with a noose tied around her neck, and there was blood everywhere. The way she was sitting made it look like she had been placed there. She called the police, who found a suicide note in the car that was blocking the road. It was from a former nurse who had recently lost her daughter. After that night, she decided she couldn't work in a cemetery anymore. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the eggplant. This one is just straight up weird. It comes from Punxsutawney. He said that one day, about 30 minutes before a funeral, someone showed up and was seen standing near a freshly dug grave. He thought nothing of it and thought they had just shown up a bit early. About 10 minutes later, he got a call from her manager. They told him someone had put something inside the grave. Confused, he went to investigate. There, in the grave, he found an eggplant. Inside the eggplant, he found a picture and some strips of paper with strange words written on them. The names of the paper did not include the person being buried, which was almost even weirder. He and his co-workers became convinced it was all voodoo. Next up at number 7 now, we have the sisters. This one comes from Fun Director. He said in their town they had 2 elderly sisters who were inseparable. They did everything together. They never married and lived together their whole lives, taking care of each other all the time. And one of their friends died, they came to the funeral. After the sermon, he ushered everyone over to the casket. Sister 1 waved at him and was sitting there holding Sister 2's hand. He and his co-workers took the casket out. He started getting everyone into their cars when suddenly he realized the two sisters are still sitting there. He walked over and asked them if everything is alright. Sister 1 calmly told him that Sister 2 had died during the funeral service, but they didn't want to make a fuss at their friend's funeral. Some people might call that respectful. Actually, no, that's just creepy. What do you guys think? Next up, number 6 now, we have the gravedigger. This one comes from Barking Panther. He said his dad was a gravedigger in the 60s. Now, one summer's day, his dad and his friend were digging graves in a field next to the cemetery. He was digging 5 feet away from a half-finished grave when his shovel hit something. It didn't feel or sound like a stick or a root. It was something different. He pulled it up with his shovel, and to his horror, it was a leg bone, a femur by the look of it. They began to dig more, and soon they found more bones. Then he found a skull and then another skull. That's when they quit. After contacting the police, they found out they had happened upon a mass grave from the Spanish flu epidemic in the early 20th century. That wasn't good enough though, and they vowed to never dig graves ever again. Next up, number 5 now, we have the exploding casket. This one comes from Oprah Lover. She said that she used to be the head of maintenance and labor at a very large cemetery. Quite often they would have to exhume old graves and resettle them due to the fact that most graves weren't buried properly before about 1920. The scary thing was though, these old coffins had a chance to practically explode. In the decades since the burial, methane gas from the decomposing bodies would fill the tightly sealed caskets. During the exhumation, it would only take a small knot from a shovel to loosen the lid, and then boom, the entire casket explodes. I'll leave the gruesome results of that to your imagination. Moving on to number 4 now, we have cremation. This one comes from Mad Muncher. They said they worked in a cemetery for around 7 years. One day they were working in the crematorium and had just loaded a coffin onto the charger. That's the device that slides the coffin into the cremator. He walked around to the computer to check the temperature and press the start button. When he got back to the charger, the coffin was now hanging off and about to fall. This was strange because he definitely put it on straight. The green light flashed and the coffin began moving forward, but suddenly it got snagged before hanging over again. Flames began running up the side of the coffin and he had to practically wrestle it into the cremator. To this day, he believes that the person really didn't want to be cremated. Next up at number 3 now, we have the kidnapping. This one comes from Adele the teacher, the same person who we talked about earlier. She said one night she was sitting in her truck while her co-worker was in the office finishing some paperwork. As she sat there, an old man came to the door and asked about finding a grave. She opened her mouth to respond when all of a sudden an old woman jumped in through the side door, pointed a finger at the man and screamed, "That man kidnapped me. Get me away from him. Don't let him ever touch me." She looked sane but in total panic. The man looked shocked and began walking away, seemingly lost for words. He asked the man what was going on. He could barely talk but muttered something about her having Alzheimer's and how hard it is to care for her. Then he got into his van and just left. She walked back to the truck. The old woman was now gone too. Her co-worker said that she had flagged down a random vehicle and just got inside. Then the man slowly drove past again. He smiled and nodded as if none of it had happened at all. What? No thanks. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the flowers. This one comes from Seagull Alumni, great username by the way. He said that in one of their mausoleums they had some crypts with enough space for caskets to go in one after the other. He gave the example of one casket going in first, then the hole is sealed, and then years later they may put another family member in after opening it again. This was pretty normal and nothing out of the ordinary usually happened. People would often put flowers in the crypt before it was sealed. One night they opened a crypt from 25 years before, and to their shock they found real fresh flowers lying inside. There was no way someone would have got in there to do that, especially without being discovered. Everybody was too freaked out to even talk about it. And finally, number 1 now, we have the smiley face. This one comes from a Warlock. They said they were weed whacking at the cemetery they worked at one day. A woman with 2 kids walked up to him and said she'd found a weird box in a Walmart bag buried by the baby section. He walked over there and and found this wooden box. It had been carved with a heart and a smiley face. There were cross bones drawn behind the heart. He opened the box to find various items like broken glass, some blue cloth and a button, just a strange mix of objects. He took it to his boss, who in turn took the box to their local priest. They concluded that it was witchcraft and urged him to not pry into the matter any further. Well, starting off at number 10 now, we have the military ghost. This one comes from a guy who said he did his military training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. The barracks were at least 50 years old by this point. Every night, new recruits were told to stay awake for an hour and mop the floor until the next soldier was woken up to take over. One night, the guy, Jack, was sitting underneath the speakers trying to stay awake when a voice came out of them. Now usually it was one of his commanding officers barking orders to wake up, but this time it was different. A soft woman's voice could be heard, barely even a whisper. She said, "Private, get everyone outside right now. Right now, Private, everyone outside." He was surprised, not because it was a woman, as he did have female drill sergeants, but because the voice was so soft. Jack headed down the hallway where he found another guard also standing duty. He asked him if he had heard the voice. The guard said no. Jack thought it must have just been his imagination and didn't want to risk waking everyone up just because his mind was playing sleepy tricks on him. The rest of the night was normal and Jack put it to the back of his mind until weeks later. One day they had a 3-day field training exercise. On the last day they all sat around a fire and everyone swapped stories. The drill sergeant shared some stories of the base. Jack's sergeant told a story of the first female drill sergeant on that base. She was harassed so much that it was unrelenting, and then one day she snapped. She hung herself from some exposed water pipes using her belt. A few years later they plastered over the exposed pipes. The reason? So they could put the speakers up there on the wall. Next up at number 9 now we have the wedding party. This one comes from Reddit user PyKing9000. He said when he was in high school he worked for a catering company, so his hours would often be very late. On one such night he was resetting a room for a wedding that was happening the next day. A co-worker told him to go upstairs and get some chairs from the room that had just hosted a wedding that night. When he got to the room he noticed there were still people in there chatting away and having a good time. He was confused and told them the wedding had already ended. He took the chairs down and told his co-worker there were still guests up there. He asked if they needed anything else from that room or should they just wait for them to leave. It was the co-worker's turn to look confused now. He said he'd just been up to that room as well and didn't remember seeing anyone up there at all. They went up to the room and sure enough the room was completely empty and looked like it had been for hours. Some Redditors think this may have been a ghostly echo of a wedding that has already happened years ago, or perhaps they were spirits looking to recreate the good times they'd had in life. Moving on to number 8 now, we have a story from UltiMabdon316. He said that one night he was working at a fancy hotel next to an airport. One night he got a call from a lady in room 204. She said there was arguing, loud banging and crying from the room next to her. He checked the computer, but the system showed there was nobody in that room due to maintenance issues. Confused, he called his supervisor to see what to do. She told him to call the on-site security and follow them up with a key. When they stepped out of the elevator, they heard the sound of crying. It was loud. His heart started racing as he neared the door. The security guard put the key in, opens up the door and flicks on the light. As they enter the room, the shower is on, steam coming out from underneath the door. There was only one lamp on in the room. The air was very cold, and then he saw her. A woman, stripped down to her underwear, was lying on the bed sobbing. As they approached, she rolled over. She was pale, covered in blood, and just staring at them. At that moment, they realized the shower had stopped and the door was open. There in the doorway was a huge, ominous-looking man. Security tased and arrested him. It turns out that he was a criminal who was hiding in hotel rooms to kidnap and sexually assault women who stayed there, sometimes murdering them afterwards. At number 7 now we have swinging. Smashly Pimpson is the Reddit user who shared this story. He said that he worked in a department store where every year before Christmas he would have to stay overnight to sort out all the new merchandise. One year he was stuffing a duvet into a bag when all of a sudden a picture frame that was just hanging up a few aisles away crashed to the ground and smashed everywhere. He was too tired to care and went to the back to get a dustpan and brush. There were plastic bags of clothes hung up on a conveyor belt on the ceiling. As he looked up, he saw one single bag was swinging hard. It was banging around as if someone had just shoved it moments ago. No other bags were moving. He freaked out and quickly grabbed a dustpan and brush and left. However, when he got to the smashed picture frame, it was gone. All of it. None of the other employees there knew what he was talking about, and the memory of that night has never quite left him. At number 6 now we have the girl. This one comes from Banksy420, who said they work in a restaurant that has its own bakery attached. All the bakery staff would always talk about the ghost of a little girl who haunted the whole place, but he didn't know that when he started the job. One day things were moving quite slow, and so he did some prep work by himself in the kitchen. He was at the prep table kind of zoning out and just listening to music. Then he felt someone right next to him, as if they were shoulder to shoulder, a sudden presence that wasn't there before. Then he heard a little girl's voice very sweetly say, "Hi Josh, how are you?" He said he even felt her breath as the words were spoken. He said it felt so vivid, but when he turned around, there was nobody there. He told his co-workers this, and they weren't too surprised. They were all quite familiar with the ghost of the little girl. They just learned to not answer her back. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the dolls. One girl said she used to work the night shift at a Greasy Spoon diner. There were usually a lot of drunk people there. Another waitress finished at 4 AM, so she was usually alone until 7 AM. One night her co-worker left and then returned just a few seconds later. She had a weird half smile on her face and said, someone put something on your car. Judging by her look, she knew it wasn't good. She went out to see every inch of her car was covered in naked dolls. There were hundreds of them. Cabbage Patch, Barbies, baby dolls, you name it, it was there. They all had different shapes and sizes. The only thing they all had in common was that they were completely naked. It took 55 trash cans to get rid of them. She was scared. In the nights that followed, she began to get very creepy calls at around 4:15 AM. It was a voice that would ask her if she liked the gift. The calls got angrier and more abusive as the nights went on, and then one night at 4:15 AM, the phone rang and all she heard was popping noises, no voices, and then the phone hung up. It's been 9 years since then and she hasn't been called since. She's curious about what happened, but also very glad it's all over. Next up at number 4 now, we have The Creature. This story was told by a woman who worked at a group home for disturbed youth. She said that 15 years ago, she was sitting in the hallway and she just felt like she was being watched all night. It wasn't the kids, they were all in bed. It was an almost physical sensation, an unseen pressure pushing down on her. She cleaned out the linen closet in the hallway and left the door open when she was done. The hallway was so narrow that the door blocked it completely. Now, to her surprise, that feeling of being watched disappeared, like a switch being flipped. Happy, she continued on like this for 2 more nights, and then on that 3rd night she was doing bed checks when something in the hallway caught her eye. She slowly turned her head to look down the hallway and froze. The linen closet door was now halfway open and there was a tall, elongated creature hunched over the back of the door, gripping it, its head peering out over it. It didn't have a face or clothes, but it was flesh colored with elongated arms and legs. It stood at least 7 foot tall. Despite not having a face, she knew that it was staring at her. She ran to the staff office and sat huddled in the corner for 6 hours until the relief staff came. She told nobody but her family, and now all of us. At number 3 now, we have The Watcher. This one comes from Reddit user Baby Butter Blues. She said that after leaving college, she got a job as a nanny for 2 elementary age girls. For the parents' anniversary, they went on a week-long cruise, and so she babysat the kids. For the first few nights, the 8-year-old would go into her room multiple times a night and wake her up. It was obvious she hadn't pre-planned what she was going to give as her reason for waking her up, so she would just stumble through an excuse on the spot, like, "I just wanted to make sure we are still going to the park tomorrow." The babysitter figured the girl was just missing her parents and feeling a bit unsettled, so she let it slide at first. However, by the 4th or 5th time, she'd had enough. She told the girl not to wake her unless it was for an emergency. With that, she went to sleep for a few more hours. It wasn't to last though. Around 5 AM, she woke up, but there wasn't any obvious reason for it. She just felt strange. She turned over and almost jumped out of her skin. The girl had brought over a chair right next to the bed and was staring at the babysitter. Her long black hair was draped over her expressionless face. The babysitter asked what she was doing. The girl simply said, "I just thought it would be fun to watch you sleep. I didn't wake you." That is where the story ends, but I presume at that point the babysitter was just sprinting down the road. That's what I do. Next up at number 2 now, we have the tapping. This one comes from Reddit user Ilanko. He said that his job in Canada involves him looking after a factory. On one winter night, it reached minus 30 degrees Celsius. It was a rough shift. One of his co-workers told him she'd cover him while he went for a quick nap in his car. He parked across the street from the plant so that his supervisor couldn't see him on the camera. With that, he fell asleep quickly. However, just 15 minutes later, he was woken up to the sound of tapping. It was around 3 a.m. and by the time he pulled himself together and looked around, he saw, well, nothing. The parking lot was big and empty, but there was nobody there at all. Whoever tapped on his window must have been able to move incredibly fast or not even be human. He was too shaken to continue his nap and so decided to head back to work and tell his co-worker about what happened. She'd been working there longer and knew the area better. She didn't seem fazed when he told her what happened. She simply said, "Oh yeah, that happens all the time with everyone working the night shift. We don't know who or what it is." Can you even imagine? I think the scariest part of that is the possibility of it not being an animal or human. What do you guys think? I also think it was probably hiding under the car. How creepy is that? And finally, number 1 now, we have the dispatcher. Ariadne Hayes said that he used to work as a police emergency dispatcher for the police department in his city. He was working overnight once when a woman called in to say her depressed husband had gone missing. The police asked around and found out that he sometimes liked to go to an old cemetery and just be alone. With this lead, they sent 2 officers out there to look for him. When they got there, they saw the door to an old stone mausoleum was cracked open. They went in and stumbled through the dark underground rooms surrounded by the tombs of the dead. Then one of their flashlights caught a figure standing at the very back. It looked like they had their guy. They were relieved. They walked towards him, but it wasn't until they were right next to him they realized they had got it all wrong. They had found the right guy, but he wasn't standing, he was hanging. The ceiling was so low to the ground that his feet were barely an inch off the floor. The officers hightailed it out of there and told the dispatcher this very creepy story.